My name is Camila Fajeda. I'm 33 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at my mother-in-law's birthday dinner, my husband Derek stood beside her chair and told 11 relatives, including his sister and her husband, that I'd been acting paranoid and unstable for months, imagining things that aren't there. He didn't know that 3 weeks earlier, I'd already obtained the itemized hotel folio from his business trip to Sacramento, the one listing 2 guests checked into a single king room for 2 nights, and my name wasn't either one of them. I didn't argue with him at that dinner. I just smiled, passed the bread basket, and finished my plate. I already knew exactly what was sitting in a folder in my car. To understand why I stayed so calm, you need to go back 7 weeks, to a Tuesday evening when a routine credit card alert on my phone showed a charge that didn't match anything on our shared calendar. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word documented in the comments if you've ever had to prove something true that someone tried to convince you, or everyone else, wasn't real. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that dinner makes sense. Derek and I have been married for 6 years, together for 8. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party, back when he was still working his way up through a smaller medical distribution company, and I remember being drawn, initially, to how easily he talked to everyone in the room, a warmth that felt genuine rather than performed. He works now as a regional sales director for a medical equipment distributor, a job that genuinely does require travel, client visits, trade conferences, quarterly regional meetings, usually 2 or 3 trips a month, something I'd never once questioned in 6 years of marriage, because it had always simply been the shape of his job, the same way my own more predictable schedule had always been the shape of mine. I work as a claims coordinator for a property insurance company, a detail-oriented role that mostly involves reviewing documentation, cross-referencing dates, and noticing when 2 pieces of paperwork that should match each other don't. For most of our marriage, I'd have described us as genuinely happy, or at least as happy as any 2 people juggling careers and a mortgage and the ordinary friction of building a life together tend to be. We'd talked in the past year about starting a family, a conversation that had felt hopeful rather than fraught, which makes everything that came afterward feel even more disorienting in hindsight. I mention all of this not to paint an idealized picture, but because I think it matters for understanding how genuinely blindsided I was when the small inconsistencies started, and how hard I worked initially to explain them away rather than face what they actually suggested. I mention my job because it's the reason I noticed something, 7 weeks ago, that I think most people would have scrolled past without a second thought. Derek and I share a joint credit card for household expenses, and I get real-time purchase alerts on my phone as a matter of habit, mostly to track our budget. On a Tuesday evening in late May, an alert came through for a charge at a hotel in Sacramento, a city Derek had told me 2 days earlier he'd be visiting for a client meeting with a medical group there. The charge itself wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the amount, $412 for what should have been a single occupancy business room for 1 night, at a mid-range hotel where I happened to know, from a work trip of my own years earlier, that standard single rooms ran closer to $160 a night. I didn't say anything to Derek that night. I told myself, genuinely, that there were a dozen reasonable explanations: an upgraded room, a client dinner charged to the room, incidentals I wasn't accounting for. I've spent enough years in claims work to know that a single anomalous number rarely tells the whole story on its own, and I didn't want to accuse my husband of something serious based on one unusual charge. What I did do, quietly, was start paying slightly closer attention, the way you do once something has nudged your sense of certainty even slightly off balance. Over the following 3 weeks, I noticed a pattern I'd apparently been too comfortable to notice before. Derek's business trips had increased in frequency, from 2 or 3 a month to nearly weekly, always explained with specific, plausible-sounding client names and cities I had no easy way to verify. His phone, which he'd always left casually on the kitchen counter for years, started staying in his pocket or his car more consistently. He became noticeably irritated in a way that felt new when I asked ordinary questions about his schedule. Not defensive exactly, more dismissive, the tone of someone who'd decided in advance that my questions weren't worth taking seriously. I want to be honest about how I felt during those 3 weeks because I think it matters for understanding what came next. I felt increasingly like I was losing my grip on something I couldn't quite name, caught between genuinely trusting my husband of 6 years and noticing a slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that my professional instincts kept flagging as worth examining more closely. I didn't want to be the kind of person who goes digging through her spouse's private life over a vague feeling. I also didn't want to be the kind of person who ignores a professional instinct that's been reliable in every other part of her life, just because applying it here felt frightening. The Sacramento trip that finally changed things happened 6 weeks ago. Derek told me he'd be gone Thursday through Saturday for a regional distributor conference, a specific enough detail that I assumed, reasonably, I could verify it if I wanted to, though I didn't try at the time. He came home Saturday evening, seemingly ordinary, tired from travel the way he always was after a trip. It wasn't until the following Tuesday, when our joint credit card statement closed for the month, that I sat down to do our usual budget review and saw the full itemized list of charges from that hotel. Not just the one anomalous charge I'd noticed weeks earlier, but 3 separate charges from the same property over those 3 days, including a $340 charge for what the abbreviated statement description listed only as F&B charge, restaurant and beverage, on a night Derek had told me he'd eaten alone in his room reviewing conference materials. I didn't confront him that Tuesday. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me, the same part that had spent 3 weeks talking myself out of my own instincts, still hoped there was an explanation I hadn't considered. I sat with the statement open on my laptop for nearly an hour that evening, rereading the line item over and over, trying to construct some version of events innocent enough to let me close the laptop and move on with my night. I couldn't quite manage it. What I did instead was something I understood clearly, from my own professional life, was the correct next step if I genuinely wanted the truth rather than another round of plausible-sounding reassurance. I called the hotel directly, the next morning, from my car in the parking lot at work, before I'd even gone inside to start my shift. I explained to the front desk manager, honestly, that I was trying to reconcile a joint credit card statement for a stay under my husband's name, and asked whether it would be possible to request an itemized folio for the stay, since the credit card statement alone didn't break down the charges clearly enough for our records. She explained, courteously, that folios are generally considered guest information, but that since I was calling from the card used to pay for the stay and could verify the last 4 digits and billing zip code, she could email an itemized copy to the address on file for the account, standard practice for exactly this kind of billing reconciliation request. I confirmed the details, and the folio arrived in my inbox less than 20 minutes later. I sat at our kitchen table reading it slowly, the same table where Derek and I had eaten dinner together for 6 years, the same table where we'd once spread out paint swatches for the living room, where we'd once made a list of baby names, half joking, half not, on a quiet Sunday morning 8 months earlier. The folio listed the room under Derek's name as the primary guest, which I expected. What I didn't expect, sitting directly beneath his name in the guest registration field, was a second name, Priyanka Bhatt, listed as an additional registered occupant for all 3 nights of the stay. A standard hotel practice of recording every adult occupying a room for insurance and security purposes, regardless of who's paying. 2 guests, 1 king room, 3 nights. My name appeared nowhere on that document because I hadn't been there, and it had never once occurred to me, in 6 years of marriage, that I might need to check whether someone else had been there instead. I recognized the name immediately, which made the entire discovery worse in a specific, particular way. Priyanka Bhatt was a regional account manager at one of Derek's client companies, someone he'd mentioned casually dozens of times over the past year, always in the context of a great working relationship or someone who really knows the territory. I'd met her once, briefly, at a company holiday party 18 months earlier. A friendly, unremarkable interaction I'd genuinely forgotten about until that name appeared on a hotel folio beneath my husband's. I remember sitting at that table, trying to picture her face from that party, and only managing a vague impression. Dark hair, a green dress, a polite handshake, the strange, almost cruel way memory refuses to hand over detail exactly when you need it most. I didn't confront Derek immediately, and I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I spent the next several days doing something closer to careful documentation than emotional processing, which I recognize sounds clinical, and maybe it was, but it's also the only way I knew how to hold myself together long enough to get through it without falling apart before I actually understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. I printed the folio. I pulled 6 months of credit card statements and cross-referenced every unusual hotel and restaurant charge against Derek's stated travel schedule, building a simple spreadsheet, the same kind of methodical work I do professionally every single day, just applied now to my own life instead of an insurance claim. I labeled columns the way I would for any claims file: date, location, stated purpose, amount, discrepancy notes, and I remember feeling a strange, hollow sense of professional competence even as my personal life fell apart one row at a time. By the time I finished, I had documented 11 separate trips over 5 months, where the pattern repeated closely enough to be unmistakable, including 2 weekends I'd specifically remembered him describing as quiet, work-from-the-hotel-room trips. I confronted Derek 2 days after finishing that spreadsheet, at home, quietly, without an audience, which felt important to me. I wanted an honest conversation, not a public spectacle. I waited until a Sunday evening, after dinner, when we usually sat together for an hour before the week started again, and I set the folder on the table between us instead of starting with words. I showed him the folio first. He denied it initially, claiming Priyanka had needed to book a room last minute through his corporate account due to a hotel system error, an explanation that fell apart within about 30 seconds once I asked him to explain the 3 consecutive nights of restaurant charges he'd told me. Specifically, he'd eaten alone in his room, reviewing conference materials. He started to repeat the explanation, then stopped mid-sentence, staring at the spreadsheet instead of at me. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat down at our kitchen table, the same table, and put his head in his hands for a long moment before he eventually admitted the relationship had been going on for roughly 5 months. I asked him, plainly, why he hadn't simply told me if the marriage wasn't working for him, rather than letting me discover it through a hotel folio and a spreadsheet. He said, quietly, that he hadn't known how to have that conversation, that it had started small and grown in a direction he hadn't planned for, and that some part of him had been hoping it would simply resolve itself, one way or another, without him having to make an active decision about any of it. I told him that hoping a marriage resolves itself while actively deceiving the person in it isn't really hoping for anything except more time to avoid a conversation he owed me from the beginning. I want to be honest about the days immediately following that conversation, because they were genuinely difficult in ways I don't think this story needs to dwell on in detail. What matters for the rest of this story is what happened next, at his mother's birthday dinner 3 weeks later. A dinner I almost didn't attend but ultimately did, partly because I hadn't yet decided how or when I wanted the rest of the family to learn what had actually happened. And partly, I think, because some part of me wanted to see, one more time, exactly how far Derek was willing to take the version of events where I was simply losing my grip on reality. I didn't expect him to stand up, mid-dinner, and tell his own mother and sister that I'd been paranoid and unstable for months, imagining things that aren't there. I think, looking back, he'd decided in advance that getting ahead of the story, framing me as unreliable before I could say anything myself, was safer than the alternative. His mother nodded along sympathetically. His sister glanced at me with something between pity and discomfort. I sat there holding a fork, listening to my husband describe me to his family as someone who couldn't be trusted to perceive her own life accurately, while I carried, in a folder in my car, an itemized hotel document with another woman's name on it. I finished my dinner. I complimented the cake. I didn't say a single word that night about what I actually knew, partly because I didn't want his mother's birthday to become the setting for what needed to happen next, and partly, honestly, because I wanted a clean, undeniable moment to finally say it, rather than an argument that could later be reframed, again, as me being unstable in front of witnesses primed to see it that way. I called Derek's sister Marisol 3 days after that dinner. Marisol and I have always had an honest relationship, closer in some ways than my relationship with Derek had become over the previous several months, and I trusted her enough to show her the folio, the credit card spreadsheet, all of it, laid out plainly on her kitchen table the way I'd once laid it out on mine. I remember her face as she worked through the pages, the way her expression shifted from polite concern to something harder, more focused, as the pattern in front of her became undeniable. She was quiet for a long time, looking through the documentation before she said, "He told us you'd been having some kind of breakdown. He made it sound like you needed help, not like this." She gestured at the folder. "This isn't paranoid, Camila. This is just true." Marisol called their mother that same evening, and I understand, secondhand, that the conversation was a difficult one, lasting nearly 2 hours according to Marisol, much of it their mother initially defending Derek before slowly, reluctantly, running out of alternative explanations for what the documentation plainly showed. Their mother had apparently repeated Derek's version of events to several other family members over those 3 weeks, genuinely believing, I think, that she was defending her son against an unfair accusation rather than defending an actual documented affair. She called me 2 days later, her voice noticeably different than it had been at her own birthday dinner, and said simply, "I owe you an apology. I should have asked to see something before I decided what to believe." I appreciated her saying that, though I told her honestly that the apology, while meaningful, didn't undo 3 weeks of being described to her entire family as unstable, while the actual instability, if that's even the right word for it, belonged entirely to the person standing beside her chair, making the accusation. She was quiet on the line for a moment, and then said something I've thought about since, that she recognized, uncomfortably, how easy it had been to believe the calm, confident version of events over the one that would have required her to imagine her own son capable of deception on that scale. "It's easier to doubt the person who seems upset," she said, "than the person who seems sure of himself. I think I've made that mistake more than once in my life, if I'm honest." 5 weeks have passed since that dinner. Derek and I are separated, working through the practical, unglamorous logistics of that decision with our respective attorneys, a process that's exactly as tedious and exhausting as everyone warns you it will be. He's reached out a handful of times, mostly variations of the same message, that he's sorry, that it was a mistake, that he never meant for it to become what it became. I believe, in a limited way, that he's genuinely sorry, though I've come to understand that being sorry and being honest are not always the same quality in the same person, and I'm not sure even now he fully understands the difference. His mother has stayed in touch, carefully, respectfully, in a way that feels like someone trying to rebuild trust in small, deliberate increments, rather than assuming it should simply resume where it left off. Marisol and I talk more now than we did before any of this happened, an unexpected, genuine friendship built out of an otherwise painful set of months. She told me, a few weeks ago, that she'd started asking Derek more direct questions about his schedule when he mentions travel now. Not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a determination, in her words, not to be the kind of family that just believes whoever tells the more confident version of events. I think about that dinner sometimes, sitting there with my fork while my husband described me as unstable to a table full of people who'd known me for years. I don't feel triumphant remembering it, even though I know now definitively that I was right. I feel mostly a kind of quiet grief for the 6 years I spent trusting someone who apparently found it easier to rewrite my perception of reality than to simply tell me the truth, and for how close that rewriting came to actually working, on people who should have known better than to believe it without asking a single clarifying question. I've also had to sit with the uncomfortable recognition that if I hadn't happened to work in a field that trained me to notice small documentary inconsistencies, this entire pattern might have continued indefinitely, with me slowly, quietly absorbing the idea that I was the unreliable one, simply because I lacked the specific professional habit of cross-referencing dates and receipts against a story I had no particular reason to distrust. I think about Priyanka sometimes too, though I've never spoken to her directly and don't intend to. I don't know what Derek told her about our marriage, or whether she was given her own version of events that made this all seem simpler or more justified than it actually was. I try not to carry anger toward her specifically, since I genuinely don't know the full shape of what she was told. I reserve my clarity instead for the person who stood in his own mother's dining room and chose, deliberately, to make his wife sound unreliable rather than simply admit what he'd done. I've started seeing a therapist over the past few weeks, not because anyone suggested I needed to prove my own stability, but because rebuilding trust in my own perception after months of subtle doubt takes real, deliberate work, and I didn't want to walk out of this marriage still quietly wondering whether my instincts could be trusted going forward. She told me something in our second session that stayed with me since, that the specific cruelty of being told you're imagining things when you're not is that it doesn't just damage the relationship in front of you, it teaches you to doubt the exact instrument you'll need for every relationship that comes after it. I'm working on trusting that instrument again, slowly, the same methodical way I approach everything else. If you're watching this and someone has ever tried to convince you, or the people around you, that your own instincts couldn't be trusted, especially when you turned out to be right, I want you to hear this, because I spent 3 weeks doubting a version of reality I already had documented proof of, simply because it was easier than accepting what that proof actually meant. You don't need permission to trust your own perception. Sometimes the truth is sitting quietly in a hotel folio, or a credit card statement, or some other unglamorous piece of documentation, waiting for the moment you finally decide to stop doubting yourself long enough to go looking for it. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time someone tried to convince you your own instincts were wrong, and what it felt like to finally have proof you were right all along. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose mother-in-law spent years calling her controlling for keeping receipts, right up until those same receipts saved the family business from a lawsuit nobody else saw coming.